Professor Robin Blackburn is our next speaker. I think he needs no introduction. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Akhil and Sanjay for inviting me to speak at the meeting, and I think it's an extremely timely topic. And I've also been reading these new books by Prabhat. He seems to produce 2 or 3 just in the last 2 or 3 years. And so they've sort of attuned me to contribute to this debate that he's been having. I thought I detected some areas of great agreement between David Harvey and some of his most recent writings and Prabhat. Both of them stress the plundering of natural resources. Both of them stress the privatization of forests and oceans as a dimension of contemporary capitalism growth and contemporary also capitalist crisis. I can see there is a difference on imperialism. I myself would come down on the side of saying that actually in the world we live in, the inequalities of power along various dimensions, military, economic, access to cultural and economic goods, I think that these divisions are so extreme, so grotesque, that I think they go beyond just pure capitalism. They imply a sort of superstructure of inequality and oppression built on top of that or stowed away underneath it. And that's what gives validity to the term imperialism. I also think we see the wars and rumors of wars, threats, the rocket rattling and the bunker busting bomber rattling that we see competitive attempts to secure control of oil and other vital raw materials. So we do see something like this structure of imperialist rivalry. We also see a hierarchy within the capitalist world and one which is maintained partly by great demonstrations of military might, but also which is maintained sort of levels of discipline of the underlying population, something Prabhat has talked about, and which we've just recently experienced in Europe, and even inside the European Union and inside the Eurozone. We see processes that are not merely capitalist, but which are very much dictated by the desire to preserve the value of money, as Prabhat has said, but which represent the most flagrant sorts of imperialism. And I suppose you've all noticed what's been happening in smaller Eurozone countries, Ireland, Portugal, and above all Greece. And we see in those countries the imposition of policies to immiserate the population in the supposed interests of finance capital. Sometimes even local finance capitalism is a bit dismayed by these draconian plans. And Prabhat does explain in the essay on imperialism in Re-envisaging Socialism that actually there is the overarching need to maintain the value of money, and that often leads to excessive deflation, especially in outlying and underlying regions and zones of the global capitalist system. And again, the term imperialism seems to be of use there. I want to say a few remarks about of a historical character, and also to acknowledge just very briefly that there is a cultural dimension which is very powerfully there, and many historians have teased it out. It's such a rich field, I can't do justice to it above rather than just mentioning it. But I would like to say on the historical plane that Prabhat had a very interesting observation that the first part of which might add some cheer to economic commentators in the United States when he observes that the leading capitalist state almost invariably comes to find itself in the position of suffering great deficits. That's not unusual. The United States, in other words, is not in a completely unprecedented plight when it finds itself unable to prevent staunch, great, yawning deficits on its current account. And the example that he gives is that actually Britain also in the later 19th century was precisely in that situation, finding itself in deficit with most of its trade partners, and it was only because of the drain of resources from India to Britain that it was able to achieve overall balance, and as he points out, even able to engage in export of capital. And of course it was that very fact which led Hobson to carry out the analysis that he did carry out of imperialism in his book of that name, which was of course such an influence on Lenin, and which was the results of which are also debated by Rosa Luxemburg. So I think there's a debate here, and there are concepts which are still worth retaining. Prabhat in his writings has referred to two forms of capitalist expansion. One is a sort of organic expansion by large and small capitals, a sort of organic internal accumulation. And the other is an external accumulation, which is achieved as a result of the appropriation of value produced outside the capitalist system itself, understood as a system of market exchanges. And I would just like to observe that I do think that this, as it were, combined and uneven character of capitalist accumulation is something typical of long periods. It's not just the 20th century or the 21st century. When I've been studying the different systems of colonial and post-colonial slavery in the Americas, I've been very struck by the fact that first, the moves towards the free market actually went together with intensification and the size of the slave systems of the United States, of Brazil, of Cuba, and other parts of the Americas. So by the mid-19th century, when there's comparative free trade in most of the Atlantic zone, actually there are more slaves than there have ever been before, and the value of slave produce is greater than it's ever been before. I call that extended primitive accumulation. So we do, and that extended primitive accumulation also played a part in an economic conjuncture that was favorable to both British and West European industrialization, and that's a famous argument, and it's gone to and fro. But I do think at the present time, following works like Kenneth Pomerantz's recent books, I think that it's been, you know, the case for seeing this primitive accumulation playing a role in helping to stabilize and even to dynamize the industrialization and accumulation in the metropolitan region. I think that case is now extremely strong. So does imperialism, what relationship does it have to the economic crisis through which we're passing? I think that the main theme of what Prabhat was saying in his introduction just now was that the imperialist policy overall is to pursue a certain measure of global deflation. And to some extent, the recent crisis can be seen. I mean, first, it is a truly global crisis, and it has global causes and consequences. And amongst those are to be found huge rates, growing rates of indebtedness. Another powerful theme was the emergence of wealth at one pole and poverty at another, an underlying capitalist dynamic that could lead on both to crisis and to imperialist attempts at coordination and re-regulation. In the sense of the poverty that led to the crisis, we should remind ourselves that it was two sorts of poverty. First, it's poverty of Asian workers, of Chinese farmers and workers, and those in other parts of Asia who were laboring very intensively but rewarded very miserably. Prabhat, incidentally, in his book gives examples in terms of actual calorie intake, where you can show the extent of poverty in many parts of the Indian countryside. And we also know that China, which has grown more rapidly than India, but still it's done so in ways which impoverish the population and which are examples of the type of accumulation that is not organic, but based on predatory characteristics. In particular, we are aware that Chinese growth, which has often been sponsored and sustained by municipal authorities through the expropriation of peasant land, and there have been great social battles which we've been reading about in the newspapers in South China and in fact in all parts of China, which are generated by this poverty. But the poverty generates not only social unrest in China, it means that there isn't demand in that great country that could help to lift and stabilize exchanges in other parts of the globe that could, for example, even lead to demand for example, US exports or via trade in some third area. So poverty in China is one powerful element, as well as riches in China, in contributing to the great crisis. But obviously the subprime crisis was something which, again, recommends us to look at polarization and inequality in the heartlands of capitalism itself and in the United States above all, and that that can't indefinitely be used to shore up demand. However, I think Prabhat's framework does help us to see that the US has been able to afford to be a little less drastic in its deflationary policies than the European governments, for example, most of the European governments. The British government sort of more or less intimates it thinks that Obama and the administration have been far too lax, and they would have done better to have the rigorous cutbacks that we've had in Britain. And yet it does seem the US economy, which is recovering just very moderately, and in a way it's the top dog position of the United States. It's the fact that above all its currency is the world currency. This allows it to run a somewhat more lax, though not infinitely lax, policy. And of course there are great controversies, and I'm not implying, I just think that the zeal to hold down wages is just at the moment a bit stronger in Europe than it is in the United States. I don't think it's absent in the United States. Obviously, there have been austerity policies here too. Just finally, I would like to say that, and this comes directly in on the theme of imperialism, that something Hobson was already warning the British about at the beginning of the 20th century is that you may be expanding the areas of the map of the world that are coloured red that you claim as part of your empire, but you're deindustrializing Britain itself. And I think that that's been an experience here in the United States too, and one which the US and the great danger we face, which goes beyond just a logic of capital, is that the United States is tempted to substitute its undoubted military assets, extraordinary as they are, as a substitute for basic productivity. And I think that the imperialist temptation is something that doesn't have a purely capitalist logic, but it's one which is set up by this combined and uneven development of capitalism, which is, of course, essential and helps to define this capitalist system. Thank you.